What the government is attempting to do is turn around educational achievement or even turn around educational attendance. Outcomes for young people attending school, if they're attending school, are certainly below par at the moment. What's broken and what needs fixing? Certainly, there is some strong debate about this in the education centre. Is, for example, charter schools, is this the silver bullet that will fix all of our education woes? Joining us on the program now is Maryanne Spurdle from the Maxim Institute. Maryanne, kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time today.
Good morning, Andrew.
When it comes to education, having a choice on where to send your kid is very important. And you can tell this by if you look at real estate prices in just about any city in New Zealand. The houses that live in the same neighbourhoods as the better schools cost a lot more than the other ones. Now, I suppose that isn't necessarily choice because not everybody can afford to live in these neighbourhoods, but more choice, more options, better educational outcomes. Is it as simple as that?
It isn't as simple as that, in that if you just increase the options, it doesn't necessarily mean things will improve.
Yep.
It means things probably will improve, because if you think about it, the money it takes to be able to live in a so-called good zone,
Yep.
it's self-perpetuating. It
Mhm.
becomes more and more exclusive. And the people who benefit from that are the homeowners and the people who already live there and the
Yeah.
real estate agents and the politicians who represent the people in those areas. So you've got vested interests for people who are, in a more exclusive set.
Yep.
And it has exactly the opposite effect in other communities. So they become less and less desirable to live in. So there are two things that you want in an education system. You want it to be performing well,
Mhm.
and you want it to be equitable. So equitable, that is not being accomplished by the current zoning and the current limited options for people who don't have money. And as far as good performance goes, there are a whole bunch of things that play into that. I think the odds that the performance will improve with more choice, but that's not a silver bullet.
No, certainly. Now, we don't want a postcode lottery necessarily for the education of children because that will perpetuate some of the inequities in our society. However, it makes sense that people want to send their children to the best schools that they can afford, the best schools that are possible. What isn't a given is that the best schools are the ones that are 100% run by the government. In fact, it's not rocket science to be able to demonstrate that, no, it's the opposite of that. Actually, it's the private schools. It's the ones that are, well, at least partially outside of the state system, which have a little bit of independence. These are the ones that are doing better. These are the ones that are sought after. These are the ones achieving better results. It seems to be the better model in some ways.
Yeah, and it's not the model so much as the ability for schools to do things the way they want to do things. So there are some public schools, there are some designated character schools, which are fully funded and have to teach the curriculum, and their teachers are part of the collective pay agreement, so they've got limited hiring pay options. However,
Yeah.
they're often created for a special reason by a specific community. They're often Maori-run schools, and some of them, there's one local here that had 100% EU pass rate, even though it's in a low socioeconomic area.
Mhm.
So it doesn't, you're not, it's not predetermined what the outcomes are going to be just because you're a state school, just because you are state funded, or just because you're in a certain area.
Mm.
When you look at the schools that are performing well, it often has a lot of community input. It often does have the input of, obviously people who parents are well educated and stuff like that.
Yep.
And it also often has the element of choice where people are choosing to go there because they're doing well.
What about the aspect of faith-based schools? And now a lot of these are integrated schools, so integrated within the broader New Zealand education system. But Christian schools, other faith-based communities. There's of course a lot of long tradition of Catholic and Anglican education here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And be fair to say that their batting averages were better than most.
Yep, it's a pretty straight line. State schools have the least good outcomes, state integrated or next, private above that. And all those things I've mentioned do play into it.
Does the faith component make a difference in that regard? Because, I mean, there's queues and people prepared to pay large amounts of money to faith-based schools, even if they don't personally hold to that faith, perhaps.
Yeah. And I think, well, and this is just my own hunch. I think there's two things. One is the way the school is run and those factors that are playing into it mean there are better outcomes. More parents are likely to want that. And then even some people who don't have a faith themselves see the value in the kind of things that are taught in those communities. So my hunch would be it's a little bit of both, but what we do know is that there's way more demand for those schools than there is supply.
Well,
and a lot of people want options that don't have them.
Yeah, no, certainly. And hey, personally, I think that faith, particularly Christianity, is good for you. However, it's not the sort of thing that we want to impose on people from a mandatory point of view. That's not the way it works. Let's do, I suppose, the comparison game, not between one type of school and the other, but on how we're doing in New Zealand compared to the rest of the world. Because, I mean, that's one way of seeing whether our current system is working, as well as looking overseas to find perhaps a system that might work better for us.
Yeah, that's one thing I've been looking into is not just equitable outcomes, but equitable choice. And looking overseas, one of the fascinating things that I've seen is that, so in the US, you've got charter schools. They've had them for 30 years.
Yep.
In the UK, they've got free schools and academies. Those have been running 15, 20 years. Australia, increasingly, the state and national government have been subsidizing tuition at both independent schools and Catholic schools, which make up a considerable, I think 20% of the kids go to Catholic schools now.
Yep.
So overseas, or OECD, by 2012, more than half of the OECD countries were contributing more than half of private tuition.
Now, we're doing that to an extent with integrated schools, but how do we compare statistically or from a percentage point of view?
We have 11% of students going to state integrated schools. There are fees, so it's not equitable because some families can't afford anything extra for education. And they don't have independence over hiring or the curriculum. The current curriculum, you can inject what you like into it. So it's pretty flexible, which has its pros and cons. But as far as hiring goes, they don't have full independence. So they're kind of a hybrid. They're independent enough to be able to teach like a faith-based or Montessori or something like that. But they're not fully independent and they're not fully funded.
Yeah.
So the access isn't completely equitable.
Terms and conditions apply in that regard. So there's huge differences then between access and choice in education in, would it be fair to say, most OECD countries compared to New Zealand?
Well, we're actually second last as far as how much the national government spends on independently operated schools. Mexico's behind us. They pay nothing. Nothing for independently operated schools, and then us. And Mexico's education system, in case you haven't heard, we shouldn't be imitating.
That we're beating Mexico, and nothing against Mexico as a country. Lovely people. However, second to last and doing better than the people that are doing absolutely nothing is, that is such an indictment on how we're doing. I know there's
kind of ironic because you've got a lot of people who are committed to the establishment saying that we've actually got heaps of choice in New Zealand because these different types of schools exist, and that we are actually quite equitable, but the choices only exist for a few.
Yeah.
That's the reality of it. And if you look at what the government is spending on what types of schools, that tells the story. Only 5% of students are not going to some kind of public school.
Yeah. No, and I suppose the outcomes speak for themselves in that regard. Now, there is a huge shake-up happening within the education sector, and reviews and panels and committees and all sorts of stuff, and it's probably going to take the entire political term to even get partway through a result on this one. Of course, charter schools was a policy which the ACT Party campaigned on. It's part of their coalition agreement. there's a lot of pushback to that for reasons, honestly, I don't thoroughly understand. In your view, Maryanne, is charter schools the answer or a version of that?
I think that they could be fantastic. There's really no downside to having charter schools. The arguments against them, so there's, they're going to be more expensive. Uh, Probably not. You look at the states. What's the figure? It's in the column for this week, but which I don't have in front of me. But it's something like 15-20% less funding to charter schools than public schools.
Okay.
On average.
So it's cheaper for the government, basically.
Yeah. For the states in the US that have charter schools, they're paying less per student. And then the outcomes on average are significantly better.
Yeah.
You've got the Credo Institute out of Stanford University has been tracking this for 15 years. And they conclusively came out last year, students are twice as likely to advance in the charter schools than in public schools. And they're looking at students from the same socioeconomic backgrounds, same areas, and they're going, there's really no downside. It's far more likely for them to advance faster. And the students who are most likely to be doing better are the least advantaged students.
Okay.
It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean because it's a charter school, it's going to do better, but it allows the things that it makes it more likely that the school will do better. And the other argument is that these schools succeed because they cherry pick the best students, as if, some kids aren't capable of excelling. Again, Credo looked at who the schools were enrolling. The charter schools were far more likely to be enrolling disadvantaged students and ones who were performing poorly. So that also not true. They're not more expensive. They're not cherry picking students. They are more likely to do better. And so if we adopt a model like that, it's most likely to actually improve things for the students who need it the most.
Yeah. I mean, better outcomes, less money. It doesn't seem like, I didn't do very well in maths at school, but even from my point of view, that seems like a winning strategy. Is it that charter schools bring less ideological control, that there's people within the education sector who have a certain strongly held view about the way things should be done, and charter schools is threatening to that? It's threatening to, I suppose, some of the social engineering that's been happening within our education sector for a generation or more?
It pretty much, for anybody in the establishment, charter schools suck because you cannot control a charter school.
Yeah.
You can legislate the outcomes. You can say they have to be performing to a certain standard, put that in their charter. They lose their charter if they don't perform.
Yep.
That's the extent of the control you have, which is fine because clearly that doesn't stop charter schools from doing well. It does mean that if you're in a position, the Ministry of Education is quite large. Teachers unions are quite large. They would not have the reach that they do now if fewer schools were under their umbrellas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a very understandable hesitancy from people who haven't experienced good outcomes from independent schools and haven't seen things in operation, haven't looked at the kind of research that's coming out of other countries. It's understandable that you wouldn't want to risk your kids' education by doing something new and untested.
Yeah.
But you've got to remember the people who are going to be setting up these schools and teaching in them are teachers. It's not new and untested. It's just being operated by different communities than currently.
And honestly, we have a generation that has been within the current system as it stands at the moment. And according to all sorts of measures, it appears that doesn't seem to be working. Again, didn't do very well in science, but basic principle of science, if the thing that you're doing isn't working, perhaps try something different, perhaps look at other evidence from overseas at things that do work. It's a compelling argument, Maryanne, I must say. Now, details of this all in an article which is going to be published on the Maxim website a little bit later this week, maxim.org.nz. Choice in education. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.